Hi, welcome back to my story time with Nana. I have a whole new story for you this week. I'm kind of partial to this story. It's where I was born. I don't really call it home, but it was where I was born. I think you're really going to like this story tonight. California. California joined the Union in 1850, becoming the 31st state. Eureka is the state motto. It means I have found it in Greek. It probably refers to the Great Gold Rush that started in 1848. California is actually known as the Golden State, maybe because of the gold rush. Even the state flower is a golden poppy. It even has a bridge called the Golden Gate Bridge. I mean, it's not made out of gold, though. But did you know that California grows the most food of all our states? I learned that from a little girl named Ruby. Here's her story. 4-year-old Ruby lived on the 5th floor of an apartment building in San Jose, California, with her mommy and daddy. She was friendly with everyone in her building, but her favorite neighbor was Mrs. Butler. Every time Ruby would visit, Mrs. Butler would always have homemade cookies or cakes for her. But what Ruby loved most about Mrs. Butler was that she was always growing some sort of fruit or vegetable out on her balcony. Ruby loved watching the plants grow from a tiny little seed. Mrs. Butler would tell Ruby how she used to live on a farm as a young girl, and her family would grow all of their very own fruits and vegetables. We only went to the store for staples like flour and sugar. I sure do miss living on a farm and having a garden, she told Ruby. Ruby had an idea. She talked to her mommy and daddy, and they came up with a plan for Mrs. Butler. The following spring, Daddy invited Mrs. Butler over for tea. Good morning, Mrs. Butler, Ruby said, opening the door. Come on in. Daddy has a surprise for you. Well, good morning, Ruby, Mrs. Butler replied. You sure look chipper today. I'm pretty excited. Wait till you see what Daddy did. Good morning, Mrs. Butler, Mommy said, greeting her at the door. Would you like to take a walk down to the courtyard with us? Tony has a surprise for you. Oh my, a surprise, she exclaimed. Sure, just let me put this coffee cake in the kitchen. You made a cake with coffee? Ruby asked. No, silly. It's just called a coffee cake because people usually eat it in the morning while drinking coffee, Mrs. Butler told her. Although I eat mine with tea. Can I eat it with milk? I'll bet it's delicious with milk, Ruby, Mrs. Butler smiled. Maybe we can have some when we come back from the courtyard. That sounds like a great idea, Daddy said. Let's head down there now. I can't wait to get back for some of that milk cake. Don't be silly, Daddy. You can eat yours with coffee. I'll eat mine with milk, Ruby said, and Mrs. Butler will eat hers with tea. How about you, Mommy? What will you eat yours with? I think I'll have some hot chocolate. So, it's a coffee, tea, milk, hot chocolate cake, Ruby proclaimed. That's a pretty long name. How about we just call it cake? I think that sounds like a smart idea, Mrs. Butler said, taking Ruby's hand as they headed to the elevator. Down they went to the courtyard. Mrs. Butler couldn't believe her eyes. Ruby's daddy had built 3 raised beds for gardening in the courtyard. What is all this? Mrs. Butler asked. Daddy built you and all the neighbors a garden, Ruby told her. Isn't that great? Now we can come down here and grow some vegetables and fruits. Look, he even planted a lemon tree right in the middle of the courtyard. Oh, this is amazing. Oh, Ruby, think of everything we can grow, Mrs. Butler said, giving her a giant hug. Oh, I can't wait to get started. Thank you so much, Tony. You're welcome, Daddy replied. Let's go have some of that fancy cake you made, and then we can get started on the community garden this afternoon. Oh, you go on up and enjoy the cake. I have a few errands to run, Mrs. Butler told the family excitedly. I'll meet you back here in a couple of hours. But, Mrs. Butler, don't you want some of your coffee cake? Ruby asked. Mommy will make tea for you. Oh, I'm too excited about our garden to eat cake, Mrs. Butler told her. You go on. I'll see you soon. So Mommy, Daddy, and Ruby went back to their apartment and ate some of Mrs. Butler's cake. And you know what? It was delicious with milk. It was delicious with coffee. It was even delicious with hot chocolate. When they got down to the courtyard later, Mrs. Butler was already there with everything needed to start planting a garden. Oh, hey, Ruby, come over and see what I have for you, Mrs. Butler waved. She looked so happy. Mrs. Butler, you didn't have to get me anything, Ruby told her. I'm happy just to be able to garden with you. Oh, I know, but these are things you will need. She handed Ruby a box. Ruby opened the box and inside was a hand trowel, little shovel, and a garden hat with gloves. The hat was green on top with pink and black dots along the brim, and the gloves matched. Oh, Mrs. Butler, I love it. You know, my hat looks like a piece of watermelon, she said, putting it on. I know how much you like watermelon, she told her. I even bought some watermelon seeds so we could grow our own. Ruby and Mrs. Butler spent the day planning and planting the garden. Several of the neighbors came down and wanted to help, and soon the courtyard was filled with people working in the garden. They planted tomatoes and peppers and carrots and green beans, corn, and various lettuces. They planted herbs like thyme, parsley, basil, and rosemary. They planted blueberries and strawberries and grapes and watermelon. Mrs. Butler took the time to add different flowers to all of the garden beds. She planted lantana around the lemon tree. This will help bring in the bees and butterflies and other good bugs to help with the pollination, Mrs. Butler explained to Ruby. It was quite the garden. Everyone was very proud of themselves. Over the spring, Mrs. Butler, Ruby, and all the residents of the apartment building worked in the garden, pulling weeds, watering, and tending to all of their seedlings. As the summer began, they harvested some of their fruits and vegetables. Everyone that worked in the garden got a share of the garden's treats. Anything left over, Mrs. Butler and Ruby took down to the food pantry to share with the neighbors in their neighborhood. As the summer wore on, they planted squash and pumpkins and broccoli and Brussels sprouts and more lettuces. This way, we'll have some autumn vegetables too, Mrs. Butler told her. Ruby loved working in the garden with Mrs. Butler, and she always wore her watermelon gardening hat. By the end of summer, the garden was in full bloom with more vegetables and fruits, and the residents decided to have a big courtyard picnic. Ruby made flyers calling the picnic the Great Garden Extravaganza event, and all of the residents were invited. Daddy and several other daddies in the building would be cooking hamburgers and hot dogs on grills, and everyone else would make sides from all the vegetables and fruits in the garden. Mommy and Ruby bought new dresses for the event, and Ruby couldn't wait to show Mrs. Butler. Mommy even bought Mrs. Butler a new floppy hat for the event. and Ruby had plans to make it beautiful. On the morning of the Great Garden Extravaganza event, Ruby went down to the courtyard with her father, and while he set up the grill, she picked flowers and then went back to her apartment to get ready for the party. Ruby attached the fresh flowers to Mrs. Butler's new hat, with her mother's help, of course, and put it in a beautiful flowery box. Ruby put on a new pink dress with green trim and her watermelon gardening hat and walked over to Mrs. Butler's apartment and knocked on the door. "Good morning, Mrs. Butler," Ruby said when Mrs. Butler opened the door. "Well, good morning to you," she answered. My, don't you look beautiful?" Ruby spun around so Mrs. Butler could see how her dress matched her watermelon hat. "Wow, that sure is a fancy dress." "Thank you. Mommy bought one just like it for herself so we could match." "Well, I don't have anything quite as fancy," Mrs. Butler said, twirling in her yellow dress. "Oh, Mrs. Butler, you look great," Ruby said with a smile. "You know what would make you look fancy?" And she held the box out to Mrs. Butler. "What is this?" "It's just a little something that will go perfect with your dress," Ruby told her. Mrs. Butler opened the box and gasped, "Oh my goodness!" She lifted the hat out of the box and placed it on her head. "This is the most beautiful hat I've ever seen," she said, looking in the mirror by the door. "Do you like it, Mrs. Butler?" "Like it? I love it," she said, hugging Ruby. "Oh, you've given me a piece of my garden to wear all day. It's lovely. I can't wait to show everyone at the Great Garden Extravaganza event. Shall we head down now?" "Yes, ma'am," Ruby said. Ruby helped carry Mrs. Butler's side dish and they took the elevator to the courtyard. Everyone was there setting up the tables and food. There were fresh salad, tomato pies, vegetable casseroles, fruit pies, and cakes, not to mention all the hamburgers and hot dogs. The residents all sat together eating in their garden and enjoyed the fruits, so to speak, of their labor. Their hard work had paid off, and it was delicious. The end. Wow, what a great story. Does it give you an idea? Like maybe you could start a community garden? How fun would that be? Well, we're in the middle of summer, so maybe you can start that next spring. Sounds like a great idea. Don't forget to share my stories. I will see you next week with a whole new United States story. See you then. Mwah.